Shields and swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
One of the things that often surprises and delights students when reading Geoffrey Monmouth's history of the kings of Britain is this sudden interlude in the middle where we get the prophecies of Merlin, these little pithy little prophecies about what's going to happen. And if you were to just go into a search engine and start searching for the prophecies of Merlin, while you'll find some academic things, some things that have to do with Geoffrey of Monmouth, some things that have to do with some of his sources, or maybe some things that came later also, you'll find a lot of less academic things where people take Merlin to be a real person and take these to be prophecies that are coming into our future. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. First one is Merlin's not a real person. But even if Merlin were a real person, this is a fictionalized version of Merlin from Geoffrey of Monmouth. So what we have here is not really a prophecy of the future. This is a kind of ex post facto telling of what has already happened by the time Geoffrey of Monmouth is writing. Mostly around Arthurian legend itself, mostly around his telling about what happens with King Arthur. So after I've thrown cold water on this, then what's the literary value of the prophecies of Merlin? Well, aside from just being interesting in their own right, they then act as foreshadowing and as a way of interpreting what happens elsewhere in the stories. It's basically a whole chapter of foreshadowing about Arthurian legend. And if you read it in that way, rather than trying to think about our future, like, oh, maybe this is something that's going to happen in the year 3000 or something. No. Think about this as something that happens later on in this book or later on in Arthurian legend. And he's alluding to this and kind of setting up how you might think about it in this interesting way. Now, aside from these being foreshadowing, really, Geoffrey does some interesting things with the character of Merlin. Now, today we tend to think about Merlin as a magician, right? As someone who does magic. And sometimes Merlin does do magic in different kinds of Arthurian legends, but especially these early times, Merlin was more of a prophet. He would tell prophecies about the future. Now, what's interesting here is we have Merlin, sort of this guy who's caught between the angelic and the demonic, right? His mother, we are led to believe, his father is a demon, his mother is a nun, and we're expressly told that demons and angels are between heaven and hell, right? And so Earth, he's kind of in the middle of all this. He's kind of in the middle of man's struggle between good and bad natures, right? In his case, this somehow gives him the gift of prophecy. And we've seen this before in other sorts of mythology. So like Tiresias in Greek mythology, losing an eye, being sort of half, at one point being male and one point being female, being of this world and not of this world, in and out, right? And we see this a lot with prophets. So that's not surprising. What's really interesting, though, of Geoffrey of Monmouth is when you read, he doesn't actually depict Merlin as much of a magician. He seems to be a kind of engineer. He talks about like devices and things that he creates to do the things. And so rather than what we normally see, which is Merlin is a prophet with some magical powers or a magician who also does prophecies, Merlin in Geoffrey of Monmouth is kind of like an engineer prophet or something. It's really fascinating what he has here. And so then how do we look at the character of Merlin, and then how do we look at the prophecies besides just being foreshadowing? I think there's a way that we can look at Merlin and Geoffrey of Monmouth as a kind of meta-narrative about the narrative, right? One of the interesting elements of, in American literature, Moby Dick, is there's a point in Moby Dick where Melville just stops telling the story. He does this often and just says, let's talk about the color white for a chapter and what the color white might represent. And I often think about this section here about Merlin in much the same way. It's almost Jeffrey having another meta commentary about what's going to happen, about Arthurian legend, and about the symbolism of it, what it might mean, and how we might understand it. And so in that way, on the one hand, it doesn't really push forward the plot, but I think it really does have a lot of interesting flavor and give us different ways of thinking about what happens. So when you're looking at Geoffrey Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain and you get to that part, I think there are a couple of things people do. They look very deeply and they're trying to take apart every single symbol, or they just kind of like, yes, a symbol, I don't know what any of these things mean. I think an interesting thing to do is after you've read it, is go through it, read it normally, but then after you've read the whole book, go back and just go until you find a prophecy that interests you, and then dig into that one to see what Jeffrey is doing there. And I think you might find you'll see something interesting.